Hello there. It's a beautiful Saturday morning. I hope you are enjoying your day so far. Welcome to today's edition of China Now, your weekly news report of what's been happening in China and across the globe. My name is Makiza Latifa. Today, let's start the show with the Thinkers Forum, which is the segment that focuses on the thoughts, perspectives, and ideas of thought leaders and thinkers who always have brilliant submissions to make on critical issues of global importance. For the first part of this segment, we have the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Middle East Eye, David Hearst, who brings unparalleled insights into the complexities of Western policies in the Middle East and the challenges faced in advocating for a two-state solution. The topic for discussion largely revolves around why the West is pursuing seemingly self-contradictory and self-defeating policies. Let's get started.
Before starting the Middle East Eye, which was exactly 10 years ago, I'd worked for 29 years for The Guardian as a foreign correspondent in Ireland, in Europe, and Russia. And my last job for The Guardian was chief foreign leader writer. And in that capacity, I frequently met ambassadors to the UK. And I remember one confrontation in particular, or one exchange with the Israeli ambassador at the time, who was Ron Prosser, who went on to become Israel's representative at the United Nations. And I asked him who were Israel's two biggest enemies. And I expected him to say Hamas and Hezbollah. What he actually said, and he wasn't joking at all, he looked at me and said, our two biggest enemies are the BBC and The Guardian. And I took what he said seriously. I didn't regard that as a joke. I regarded that as a threat. And I left The Guardian 2 years later in 2013. The actions of, let's say, just America, but also France, Germany, and particularly Britain, have always been self-defeating in the Middle East. Their policy, all the governments of the West advocate a two-state solution, i.e. the creation of a Palestinian state in the sort of 22% of Palestine that is left in the West Bank and in Gaza. But they are supporting a government in Israel that has absolutely vowed not to do that. In fact, they recently passed a law in the Knesset in which the entire Knesset, or most of the Knesset there, voted in favor of this motion, including Benny Gantz, i.e. the so-called liberal opposition. Everyone voted against the creation of a Palestinian state. And yet that is the official policy of the UN, China, of Russia, of every major power in the world. So why is it that America continues to arm a government that absolutely defies and continues to defy its wishes? This has been the case for decades. In fact, Biden has been much more pliant than Republican presidents have been of the past. And I'm thinking of Ronald Reagan, who told Yitzhak Shamir to stop the shelling of West Beirut.
The world can no longer accept a situation of constantly escalating violence.
In 1982, I'm thinking of H.W. Bush, Bush's father, who threatened to withdraw funds because of the actions of the settlers. These are Republican presidents who were prepared to put the screws on Israel and say no. But Biden has been absolutely pliant, and he's been personally pliant to Israel. And he's lost a lot of support as a result of that. Why? Because he's an old man. He is an instinctive and generational Zionist and supporter of Israel. He was around as a politician, when Israel was created. He's a generation that remembers the Second World War and the foundation of Israel. However, 2/3 through the war, America changed its position radically. It started by voting against any ceasefire deal in the UN and said Israel had a right to defend itself. So it permitted the slaughter, even though this was much more than a right to defend itself. It and the UK and France and Germany all voted in favor of the war continuing for many of the 10 months. Then Biden realized, A, it was harming him electorally in Minnesota and in Michigan and from the Arab community there, but it's harming his re-election prospects in the key swing states. But also he realized that actually the Israeli army was not winning. It hadn't defeated Hamas, and it hadn't eradicated Hamas. And that's when he decided, and it hadn't degraded Hamas significantly. So Biden changed tack and called for an immediate ceasefire in a personal address. He said this was clothed as an Israeli offer, but it wasn't. It was America saying this. And there was a resolution by the UN. Before that, under the auspices of Ian Burns, who is the director of the CIA, Hamas signed a ceasefire agreement in Cairo, negotiated in Cairo, in Doha, they signed it, which said very much the same thing. And Israel immediately backed away from it and said, no, the Egyptians changed the terms. The Egyptians didn't change the terms. Now what we want is for America to apply pressure on Israel to go towards that deal. But Biden threatened, he's continued to arm Israel. And he's just signed a $20 billion arms deal with Israel. So if you look at it from Netanyahu's point of view, why on earth should he change? Biden does what he wants anyway, and Netanyahu can defy him and talk over his head and get rapturous reception in a joint session of Congress. So until actually you have an American president that's prepared to bite the bullet and say, if you do this, there will be consequences on you, Israel, and you will not like the results. But I think there's another factor here that is, which is not just about Israel defying America's wishes or Israel being the policeman that America always wants in the Middle East. It's more broadly, and I saw this as a correspondent. I was sent to Russia on the eve of the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? 1991, 1992. And I covered the first years of the Boris Yeltsin government in Russia. And at that time, America was the indisputed master of the world. It was indisputed of the economy. It had the largest army. The people of Russia were overwhelmingly pro-Western, overwhelmingly. And in 10 years, America squandered that position in Russia and then went on to have a series of liberal interventions, all wars that went wrong after 9/11. Everything that America has touched since Bosnia and Kosovo has gone wrong for America. So if you compare the position of America when I first went to Moscow in 1991, 1992, to the situation it's now in, it is literally light and dark. And it's thrown away this opportunity to create a new world order that was free of domination, that was based on equality and based on treaties. And it could have had a treaty with Russia about Europe, and particularly Ukraine, that I know very well. It could have had a treaty with China. It could have had, NATO needn't have expanded eastwards, right? There are other ways of projecting power. And even Putin arrived as an unknown on the scene in 2000, right? As a prime minister of a very ailing and ill Boris Yeltsin. He was pro-American when he started. He went on yachting trips with the two Bushes, father and son. It took 7 years for the penny to drop that his alliance with America was not an equal alliance. It was about American domination. And America was ideologically incapable of seeing things from a non-American point of view. And that is the problem. So you've got two problems in America, right? The next American president has two very, very strategic problems. How to manage withdrawal, which he is trying to do in the Middle East, right? And how to manage decline. And that is, for empires, an incredibly difficult thing to do because its whole military-industrial complex is built on war. Its industry is built on that. Its diplomacy is built on coercion. But I think the fundamental problem with America is it's incapable of actually tailoring a foreign policy built on its own pragmatic interests and what it can do and what it can't do. If I was an American planner, I would not start wars. I would learn the mistakes from the wars, many of them, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, all of them have ended in failure. All they've done is to wreck the countries. And even now, take one very small example, Afghanistan. Afghanistan, the West has a real problem with the Taliban over its treatment of women and women's education. However, it continues to starve Afghanistan of funds, which is it's money that the Taliban need. And a former intelligence officer serving intelligence officer of Pakistan told me this. He said, it's very simple with the Taliban. There's an absolute equation. The poorer they are, the more religious they get. The richer they are, the more, it's a totally pragmatic view. And Biden not only starved them funds, it took them the funds and repurposed them. And so if you actually want to make a very pragmatic change, which would directly affect the ability of women to be educated by Iran, you give the Taliban money. I know, of course, it's the last thing that America would do because the Taliban kicked America out. But that's the pragmatic thing to do, and they're incapable, ideologically incapable, of making pragmatic decisions, which at least would de-escalate things. And Europe, and we can discuss this later, is also incapable of really standing up to America because it's got huge problems, social problems of its own. So we don't have a West that, for one reason or another, is capable of promoting, analyzing its mistakes, number one, two, promoting a new and realistic foreign policy that would advance the cause of peace and de-escalate the many conflicts that are taking place around the world. What we've got a formula for is re-escalation of conflicts. So it's all about repurposing forces to confront China. But again, we're a million miles away from the attitude that says we have made mistakes, now let's learn from them. And they're not learning, they're just repeating the same ones.
And that was an absolutely brilliant submission. Now let's continue the show with Glenn Diesen, who is a professor at the University of South-Eastern Norway. He speaks on the forthcoming American elections and other related issues.
Trump is a bit of a wild card. He can say one thing and he might mean it, but how he's going to implement it is not really clear. But what is clear is that Trump is seemingly very interested to end the Ukraine war. And this is also evident by his pick of Vance as his VP, who's also calling this a loss for the United States. But it's not clear what he will do if he doesn't get the peace he wants. And it's important to also interpret what Trump is for, because he's not against American empire. His main concern is there's no return on investment. It's not sustainable. This is why he's always very worried that America's allies is taking us for a sucker. So we're taking all security dependent. We're taking the security guarantees, but we're not giving anything back. This is his main concern. An empire should be able to make money of its empire. Ukraine is losing investment. They're not. It's costing America billions of dollars, and you can't really defeat Russia. No one even defined what victory over the world's largest nuclear power would actually mean, especially when Russia considers this to be an existential threat. So the whole thing is has been silly. And this is quite obvious. This is why for 2.5 years in the West, we haven't talked about what victory means. And unfortunately for China, it probably would like to focus some of this against the Chinese instead, as being the main rival of the US. Hopefully he's pursuing industrial policies and subsidies and all, but and not pursuing militarizing the economic disputes. But that's not a certainty thing either. So Trump wants to end the Ukraine war. He seems to be willing. He's at least on one occasion said he's willing to take NATO expansionism off the table in terms of Ukraine, and that is the key thing to solve this crisis. Of course, now we have territorial disputes too, but that is the source of the war. But it's unclear whether or not he's going to be willing to make these territorial concessions, because Trump sells himself as the great deal maker. What if he gets a poor deal from the Russians? And he will get a bad deal, because Russia will not trust anything that America signs. So if he doesn't get a good deal, what will he do then? That's not clear. Is he going to get his peace in 24 hours? I really doubt it. And if so, he's going to have to use huge pressure, which will maybe even just escalate the conflict. So I think, it would, but it's much better promise than the Kamala Harris presidency, I guess. So, but while I would see Trump very optimistically in terms of ending the Ukraine war, on other conflicts, be it the Israel-Palestine conflict, I think there's a bipartisan consensus. They're all they're all not pro-genocide necessarily, but they're all pro unconditional support for Israel. And the same goes for China as well. I think both the Democrats and the Republicans are quite hostile to China. So again, keep in mind that all the things Trump did, all the policies towards China, all of them were kept under Joe Biden. So I don't think that much will change based on who sits on the throne. But the one exception, of course, is Ukraine. That's the one really divisive issue in American politics. I think it will be look back at a historical mistake, how we pushed the Russians out of Europe. Before 2022, we saw the Germans, the French, what were they saying? They were saying, listen, we can't have too many sanctions on the Russians because we're going to push them out of Europe and into the hands of China. And this will be a huge loss for the West. And the Russians could diversify who they supply their energy to, but we in Europe would not be able to diversify who we source new energy from. So now we have less reliable and more expensive energy, which is why our industries are becoming less and less competitive. As a European, I'm not happy to see this. We're just becoming more and more dependent on the US. If you want an extreme example, look at Nord Stream. Everyone knows the United States blew this up. Even, they would try to blame it on the Russians, but even the Americans are saying it wasn't the Russians, which meant it's either the Ukrainians or the Americans. And if it was the Ukrainians, which I don't think it was, they wouldn't have done it without the green light or the knowledge of America or participation. So they blew up the main gas pipelines we had, sustaining our industries, and the Germans have to stand there and smile and make excuses for the ones who did it. I mean, it's a huge case of Stockholm syndrome. 3 years ago, I published a book. It was called Europe as the Western Peninsula of Greater Eurasia. And one of the key arguments was how Europe would have to transition from the unipolar order to the multipolar order if it wanted to remain its relevance. When once you have as many other centers of power, the Europeans would have to adjust their policy in order to remain relevant. And the most important thing, again, is diversify. The Europeans need diversification, just as we spoke about the Russians need. They need to have connections with Russia. They need to have connections with China and the US. And this is a key component if you want to have also maintain proper political autonomy. And what we've seen is the Europeans have been abandoning it. We're behaving as if it's still the 90s. So we are prioritizing relations with the US. So the Americans, of course, they have an interest because they would like for Europe to cut itself away from other centers of power. And in Europe, we're very obediently doing it. They say, cut yourself off Russia. Okay, cut yourself off China. And many Europeans are doing this. But what would happen then? Well, we would become excessively dependent on the United States. We would not have the same economic efficiency, prosperity, so we become poorer, more dependent on the US, less able to actually pursue our national interest, and you would see Europe over time become less and less relevant. And this is our failure to transition from unipolarity to multipolarity. And the only world we kind of known since World War II was to live under US protection. So we hurried under the US umbrella again and surrendered a lot of the geoeconomic and political autonomy, which the Europeans have been building up. Now, so what we see now is political independence has been largely lost. as you know, the United States also finance a lot of this. They call it non-governmental organizations, but they're really funded by the government, and they're often staffed by people with close ties or even background from the intelligence community. So this is a way of manipulating civil society of other states. Now, whenever countries, be it Georgia or anyone else, pursues laws to limit the power of these so-called NGOs, we punish it. Instead, we should be looking at emulating it. We shouldn't allow foreign powers to try to hijack our civil society. This is unacceptable. And what happens when you're not able to protect your national interest anymore? You're going to have legitimacy crisis. You're going to have political crisis. And this is what we see. We see political leaders can be changed, but the policies can't be changed. And this is why you have more and more economic problems across Europe. You will have more and more political upheaval, riots, and the Europeans now become quite extreme. Look at the EU today. It was considered a peace project. Every time there was conflicts around the world, what would the EU do? They would say, listen, stop the fighting, let's have a ceasefire, sit down and talk to each other. We might not agree today, but let's start the talking. In Ukraine, we essentially criminalized negotiations and diplomacy when countries like Hungary, which actually has the rotating presidency of the EU, they went to China, Russia, Ukraine, trying to facilitate. The EU responded by punishing it because you don't talk to your adversaries. This is what the new foreign policy chief of the EU is actually saying. We don't talk to Russia because they're war criminals, so we can't talk to them. This is insane what's happening in Europe now. And this is not healthy, and you can't look at what's happening in Europe now if you don't see it in the context of the overwhelming US influence. So the consequence, Europe is losing relevance, it's becoming subordinated. There's not all bad things about the United States, but everything is, there's dilemmas. Yeah, we should have America as a close friend. They should have a place in Europe, but this subordination is just really, really breaking Europe, I think. And as we're falling and Europe is in decline now, some will break free. And you see this Hungary, Slovakia, Italy. Those who will seek to protect their national interests will have to start to gradually break a little bit free. But then Europe loses its collective bargaining power. So there's no good solutions going forward unless, again, we diversify. And then we need China, we need Russia. But this is not going to happen. The main concern often in Europe is that China is, we say, undermining EU solidarity by picking out nation states, but instead setting up bilateral partnerships. But this is also, it's not completely fair to put this on China, because China will advance its own economic interest. And if the EU is aligning with the US in order to put all these draconian tariffs and push back against China, which goes against the national interest of its member states, why wouldn't these member states reach out directly? That's, again, what the Hungarians have done. This is what the Italians are now doing. This is a problem of regionalism. If you want this regional institution, it has to be able to deliver actual goods to its member states. I really think that a key problem is one thing that's struggling in the US, and I guess collective West, is the lack of political imagination. It's very hard for us to imagine a world where China would not just be equal, but be more powerful. It's because after the Cold War, we had this thesis of the end of history. The assumption was, the world would be aligning under the West. As America said, we are now the leader of the world, as Bush said in '92, and the world would align under liberal democratic ideals, under American leadership, and this would be the liberal peace, if you will. Now, this is falling very quickly apart, and so I don't think there's any political imagination of how to treat countries like not just China, but Russia as equals. It's very difficult. If we had been able to do that, I don't think we would have these conflicts at the moment. If you criticize the excesses of liberalism in Europe these days, you are seen as some crazy far right, or very nasty labels will be given to you. Yeah, I wrote a tweet about the opening show, and it got almost like 400,000 views or something, because it was I think it shocked a lot of people, and it kind of shows the duality, because liberalism is based on two ideas which contradict each other. One is always tolerance, but the other is the assumption of universalism, that will all go towards the same progressive ideas. And so that's why you see often the contradictions. Like, why would they mock Christianity in this way by comparing the Last Supper with some drag show and this blue Smurf? I don't know even. Yeah, anyway, so sexualized Smurf. Well, what was the point of this? And I think that's the point. There's very little tolerance, for example, towards Christians. This is because there's assumed that this kind of communitarian ideas will be abandoned. And this is a long discussion ever since the French Revolution. Because when the French Revolution was introduced, it came with nationalism, but also democracy. And this was the liberal nation state. Now, many have assumed that for liberalism to really work, it has to decouple itself from nationalism. By decoupling liberalism from nationalism, or the spirit of religion, as the Tocqueville would say, the liberalism, like a flower, would cut off its own roots and it would die. And this is what I'm seeing, which is why liberalism today is not very liberal at all. It's hate against Christians. It's just a huge animosity towards anyone who doesn't conform to these new principles. So it's very strange, unfortunate time for liberalism, and very little efforts I see now to really reflect on what is going wrong. Liberalism, before it became an ideology or almost a religion in the West under neoliberalism, there were always recognition of some of the problems. Liberalism then is putting the individual first. But keep in mind that how liberalism thrived in the West, it was the liberal nation state. So the nation state is a conservative concept because it promotes a communitarian identity. So you have a people, a common history, common culture, common language, common faith, and this is kind of what you build the collective consciousness on. And within that space, we carved out a good space for the individual, for liberalism to thrive. And the problem, I think, which we've seen over the past few decades now, is that liberalism has begun to divorce itself from the nation state. So we can't have a national culture. We're going to have to have multiculture. We also have radical secularism. We begin to abandon a lot of the collective. And if you look back at when a Frenchman, if you will, Alexis de Tocqueville, in the early 19th century, he went to visit the United States to see how did liberalism work in the US. Well, what made it work? And one of his main conclusions was that the spirit of liberty, that is of the individual, was always balanced by the spirit of what they called then religion, which was then the communitarian, the collective, which tied things together, and also had a moral foundation, which everything wasn't about the self. And he said, with this balance, it would work. But he said, over time, it's in the nature of liberalism to become more free, to free itself from all external constraints. But then it means that the individual decouples itself from the state. It doesn't accept authority from the family, from the father, from the teacher. So across the board, what is an individual which only identifies based on yourself and not the communitarian identities? It's narcissism and nihilism, and this is one of the plagues we really have as countries undergo, be it industrial revolution, globalization, pursue more individual rights. This is all fine and well, but it has to be rooted or balanced by the communitarian, which is why, for example, if you look towards China, when they now developing their economy fast, more liberal than it's been before, what at the same time it's also trying to strengthen thousands of years of history, its national culture, and this is what it has to do. It has to have an anchor in the more perpetual, and I think that's something that we lost sight of in the West by glorifying the individual and forgetting about communitarian ideas, and it goes against a lot of the early literature on liberalism.
And wrapping us up on today's edition of the show is the chair and professor of the Department of International Relations at Tsinghua University. His discussion on this part of the Thinkers Forum focuses largely on China-Africa relations. According to him, there's been a lot of change and transformation in Africa, which is very impressive. And Africa is an aspiring continent looking for approaches and solutions for their development. Stick with us for more details.
When I visit Africa, I see a lot of things which actually reminded me of China like 40 years ago. And the deficient infrastructure and the lack of industrial facilities, and also the relatively laid-back lifestyle. This all look pretty similar to the underdeveloped China many decades before. But during also my decades-long study on Africa, I also see a lot of change and transformation. So that's the other part of my impression on Africa. So Africa is an aspiring continent, looking for approaches and solutions for their development. So there are a lot of energetic and brilliant Africans who are very adamantly seek the solutions for their continent's rise. It was rather used by the Western colonialists during their colonial expansion. So no wonder it was actually an Indian scholar who proposed this term. His idea behind proposing this term is actually compare China to the East Indian Company. But that's something totally anachronical, because the colonial powers that time, they actually took advantage of these non-Western countries which have little ideas of financing of modern market economy. So they said, okay, we will lend money to you, and trying to trap you with this kind of infrastructure loans, and later they can seize the asset and the operation right of this infrastructure. But you see, this is not the case in 21st century. In 21st century, every country has their sovereignty, and they are independently, autonomously consider their development. And China is especially respecting this sovereignty, and so that's reflected in China's famous peaceful coexistence principles. China rejects any kind of intervention into this country's domestic politics and also their rights on their facilities. So China just give the loans to the companies as actually a commercial activity, but also as a development cooperation. So because in Africa, as well as in many developing countries, there's a huge demand for their infrastructure investment, but these countries, they don't have enough capital. So therefore, they borrow from China to work on this. And this is a totally like equal cooperation relationship. There's not any evidence on China actually tried to intervene and take this in facilities their ownership. And also then in this loan cooperation, it's usually the borrowers, they proposed that they want to borrow what kind of money and to build what kind of projects. Most knowledgeable and African scholars and also professionals, they just wipe this kind of argument away because they consider this words, this kind of reports as quite ignorant about the Africa's intention, about the real cooperation on the ground. They said Africa actually need capital, need investment. And this kind of ungrounded report, they actually really affect Africa's normal borrowing process and add a lot of additional costs and also disruption to Africa's development. And but however, this some of the Western media, admittedly, they have quite enormous influence on the public. So therefore, this term, they may also be used by the public, by the politicians, especially by some opposition parties in Africa, as a weapon to blame Chinese, blame the ruling party. And so this is how the African infrastructure development is interrupted by this kind of ungrounded blame. Yeah, so the China-Africa cooperation, they really substantially take off since 2000 with the establishment of Forum of China-Africa Cooperation. We see the collaboration has accelerated substantially. And from infrastructure to manufacturing to agriculture, and also the trade and this financing activities, the China-Africa actually has a very comprehensive growth in almost all the aspects. So in that general trend, we see some like big projects like Addis Ababa, Djibouti Railway, Nairobi, Mombasa Railway. We also see the big dams like Bui Dam, Tekeze dams, and a lot of ports and industry zones in Nigeria, Zambia, Egypt, etc. But I would say all these projects, they are still just a part of the ongoing process. We cannot at this point simply claim some are really successful, because these projects and achievements should be put in the bigger context of ongoing development. I would say this China-Africa cooperation is only successful when we really see Africa achieve sustainable and large, broad development, as well as China are able to sustain their global engagement, and especially their engagement in Africa. So that actually requires still quite a long time to see, because we see it's only over 20 years for this continental scale development. That's still a short time. I think the Chinese are in general more confident or optimistic about Africa's development. And the main reason is because China exactly looked like Africa 40 years before. So therefore, then the Chinese, they always say, okay, there are numerous challenges, but China used to be this as well. So if we work hard enough, Africa can be also like become China today. And so therefore, this is the thought of confidence. But in spite of the optimism, then when you really work on these challenges and operate, then you really need the down-to-earth pragmatism. And I think this is also the most of the Chinese, they grow up through this down-to-earth work. So therefore, they are also know this how to work really on this small details and really work on the ground instead of just giving some idealistic principles or theories. So this is what I think the Chinese, they are unique in comparison to many other countries. The Westerners, because they actually, their development history was already over century. So therefore the current Westerners, they only have some theories and they do not know how to really make that happen from the ground. So in China, this vision of growth, they actually come from this comprehensive teamwork. So that's why we see now China, Africa, they work in on many fronts all at the same time. So this will gradually move the transformation forward. So we cannot 100% say, okay, what it will be in 20 years or in 30 years. So we understand Africa is not China. So the path will also be quite different. And but the Chinese and as well as Africans, we are still confident when China can do that during past 40 years, Africans can do that as well.
And all too soon, we've come to the end of another thought-provoking episode of your favorite news and current affairs talk show, China Now. As we always say, let China not be far away from you anymore. If you'd still like to know other things about China, please send us a message through the email provided below. My name is Makiza Latifa, and I say thank you for spending some 60 minutes of your morning with us here on China Now.